Episode 1. The Gospel that Erased Itself from Memory. I arrived at the monastery on a Thursday. I remember the sky being bloodless gray and indifferent, as if even God refused to look down on that place. They didn't open the gate right away. The old monk, who finally appeared behind the rusted bars, looked at me as though I was already dead. "You're here for it, aren't you?" I said nothing, just showed him the sealed letter from the Vatican. He read it, he didn't bow, didn't welcome me, just whispered, "Then God help your memory." The gates groaned, like something being unburied. The gospel wasn't kept in the chapel. It was hidden in the crypt down a stairwell, so narrow I had to turn sideways to pass through. The walls were wet, the air tasted of old blood and incense. And then, I saw it. It wasn't a book, not really, more like a stack of leather-bound pages stitched together with what looked disturbingly like veins. The monks had placed it on a stone altar that was darker than the rest of the room, stained or cursed. "Has anyone read it?" I asked. Brother Lucianthodus answered in a cracked voice. 6 tried, and one screamed until his heart stopped. Another forgot how to walk. The youngest forgot his own name. One bit off his tongue. The 5th wandered into the woods barefoot. We found his skin, not the rest. The last, what? Lucian looked at the gospel like it might speak. The last remembered something it should never have known. I should have left. I should have ordered it sealed and buried. But the first rule of the Vatican's silent office is, read what you fear, or it will write itself into someone else. I took a scalpel, drew a shallow cut across my thumb. The gospel drank it. I mean that literally. The blood sank into the page and vanished. And then, words appeared. No ink, just presence. The first verse read, "This book was not written for the saved. It was written for the wounded, and it remembers what even God has chosen to forget." I blinked, and suddenly didn't remember why I came. My name, still there, but my father's face was gone. The smell of my mother's hands after she made bread. Erased. The name of the church I served for 18 years. Gone. The gospel had taken something, and I had only read the first line. Later that night, I tried to write what I saw. I read, but the ink turned blank. I bled again, just to test. The same line returned, but the next verse remained hidden. The gospel only reveals itself one wound at a time, and something tells me, the deeper the cut, the darker the memory it erases. Episode 2. Only the wounded may read. They warned me not to bleed again. After the first line, after that cruel theft of memory, I swore to lock the gospel away, burn it, even, but the pages refused to catch fire. I tried 3 times. The candle flames bowed toward it, then died without smoke. It wanted to be read, and it knew I wanted answers. That night, I sat alone in the chapel. The crucifix above the altar had begun to crack hairline fractures along the ribs of Christ. His eyes no longer looked upward, but downward, toward me. I don't know what madness lives in curiosity, but I felt it, breathing beside me like a second shadow. I opened the gospel again. The first line had faded, as if ashamed to show itself twice. Only emptiness greeted me. I pressed the blade to my wrist, not deep, just enough to draw. The blood hit the page, and again, it drank. The parchment pulsed beneath my fingers like something alive. Then the words formed. I whispered them aloud, though I don't know why. They felt like they demanded a voice, not a prayer, a confession. Do not offer me clean hands. I am a gospel for those who bleed to remember. He who reads without pain shall see nothing but blank salvation. I felt it then, not pain, but grief. A sudden, impossible grief for something I didn't know I lost. I wept, not for myself but for a man I once gave last rites to in a field hospital. I couldn't recall his name, but the memory came back. His eyes were blue. His last word was Clara. The gospel had returned the memory it stole, but behind it came an Othera memory that wasn't mine. A child kneeling in a dark room, holding a nail, whispering a prayer that bled. The next day, the monks wouldn't meet my eyes. One of them, Brother Thomas, confessed during breakfast that he had dreamed of my wounds. He described them in detail. The cut across my wrist, the tremble in my lip as I read. He even mimicked the way I whispered the words. "But how could you see?" I asked. "You weren't there. I didn't dream you." He whispered. "I dreamed the book. It was reading you." Before sunset, another monk bled without injury. just Saturday during prayer, and began leaking crimson tears. He hadn't touched the gospel, hadn't even entered the crypt. When I asked him what he saw, his voice cracked. A throne made of mouths, and a handwriting in blood across the sky. He pointed to me, terrified. You said the words. I went back down that night, alone. The gospel Saturday waiting. No dust ever settled on it. No cobwebs touched it. I bled again, deeper this time. A longer line across my forearm. The parchment pulsed harder. The verse returned. Only the wounded may read. Only the dying may understand. I stared at that last line, and in that moment he felt a heartbeat. Not mine, not God's, the gospel's. It was awake. Episode 3. The verse that made the blind nun see. Her name was Sister Agnes. She had lived in silence at the monastery for 41 years. Blind since birth. Her prayers were always soft. She never raised her voice, never asked to see the world she'd been denied. She only listened, and somehow, it always felt like God answered her more clearly than the rest of us. Until the day she touched the gospel. It wasn't meant to happen. The monks were moving relics after a storm flooded the western hallway. The crypt had to be cleared temporarily, and no one would admit hold the gospel unattended on the chapel altar. No veil, no chain, just exposed. I was out walking the eastern grounds when I heard the screaming. When I ran back inside, I saw the blood first. It trailed from the altar to the base of the statue of Saint Cecilia. A trembling handprint, red and shaking, smeared across the marble. Then I saw her. Sister Agnes was curled on the floor, shaking violently. Her hands were covered in blood but uncut. Her eyes, once pale and clouded, were now open, staring into something the rest of us couldn't see. She was seeing, but not us, not the room, not the stained glass windows. Something else. Don't take it away, she said, voice ragged. Let it finish the sentence. Her lips moved faster than her breath could keep up. Her hands twitched like they were tracing invisible scripture in the air. Then, suddenly she went silent. Her gaze locked on me. I saw the verse. She whispered. What did it say? I asked, kneeling beside her. Agnes smiled, but it wasn't joy. It said, Blessed are the blind, for they see without filters. But cursed are those who look upon me and understand. Then she began weeping. Thick tears of blood poured down her cheeks. She clawed at her own eyes, as if she couldn't stand the vision that had replaced her darkness. We restrained her. We prayed. We tried holy water, but nothing brought her back. That night, I opened the gospel again. I needed to know what she saw. I bled, but the page remained blank. I cut deeper. Still nothing. Then I remembered her handprint smeared across the statue. The blood that wasn't hers. The blood that made her see. And a horrible realization took root in me. She hadn't read the gospel. The gospel had read her. 3 days later, she vanished from her bed. No sign of struggle. No trace of footprints. Just one thing left behind on her pillow. A small, folded scrap of parchment, written in blood. A verse none of us had ever seen before. When the blind see truth, their eyes become doors. And through doors, old voices return. It wasn't written in her handwriting. It wasn't written in mine. It was written in the same script as the gospel. And it wasn't fading. Episode 4. They buried the last reader alive. The crypt smelled different after Sister Agnes vanished. Less like damp stone, more like breathe something exhaled and watching. I stopped lighting candles when I entered. The shadows clung tighter without flame. But the gospel didn't want light. It wanted intimacy. Darkness made it whisper louder. And that's when I heard it for the first time. A voice seen it spoken, but scratched behind my thoughts, murmuring a name I didn't know I remembered. Brother Emeric. I asked the monks about him. Their faces turned gray. Brother Lucien finally told me Emeric was the last man to read the gospel aloud. Not just a line, a full page. He bled for it, opened his own chest to soak the parchment. No one stopped him. By the time they reached him, the words had filled the entire page, and his eyes had turned black. He said something was coming. Lucien whispered, something that used to live above the throne. What happened to him? I asked. They didn't answer. I found that answer myself. He took a pickaxe and a night alone in the forbidden vault beneath the garden well. There, behind crumbling bricks, I found a sealed coffin, wooden, unmarked, and chained shut with rosaries. Inside was a corpse, still clothed in robes, mouth sewn shut with golden thread, hands clenched around a page, not parchment skin, and on it, written in blood darker than mine. I read it, I should not have. I am not dead. If you open this coffin, it will remember me. As I touched the skin page, I heard a breath, not mine. The corpse chest rose slightly, like it remembered how. The rosaries began to rattle. I ran. I locked the vault, burned sage, prayed like I hadn't prayed since my ordination. But the damage had already spread. That night, 3 monks fell bleeding from their noses, muttering verses that aren't in any Bible. One tried to write them down. The ink burned through the paper. The second whispered a new verse while sleeping. The buried reader is not silent. He listens through the stone. The third disappeared into the chapel just before dawn. We found him kneeling, mouth sewn shut with his own hair. The gospel was open again. I hadn't left it that way. A new line bled onto the page, written in a handwriting that matched no one in this monastery. Not mine, not Lucian's, not Americ's. The last reader was buried to keep the verse from finishing. But every time it is read again, the ending remembers its shape. And beneath that, the words, "You are finishing him. I haven't slept." I keep hearing scratching under the stone floor. Not rats, not wind, fingernails. Episode 5. The priest who forgot how to pray. I've said the same prayer every morning since I was 12. It's muscle memorized rhythm of words I didn't even need to think about anymore. Until today, I knelt at the side of my bed, folded my hands, opened my mouth, and nothing came. No Our Father, no Hail Mary, not even the silence that usually comes after a prayer. Only static in my mind like 1,000 voices coughing into a microphone. I tried again and again. My lips moved, my tongue curled, but the words were missing, like someone had gone into my soul with scissors and cut the wires. I wasn't just forgetting how to pray, I was unlearning it. I ran to the chapel, grabbed the Bible, flipped through every page, Genesis, Psalms, Revelation, but every time I tried to read a passage aloud, the words blurred, not the ink me vision, like some invisible fog sliding over my eyes. The moment the verse reached my lips, only one book still spoke to me, the Gospel in the Crypt. I didn't want to bleed, but it felt like the only voice I still remembered. So I bit my thumb hard, let the blood drip onto the waiting page. The words rose slowly this time, not going, but burning etched in red, like fire branded into flesh. Prayer is the language of the saved. You are no longer among them. I felt something twist in my chest, not guilt, not shame, loss, and then the second line bled through. To speak to him, you must first be unheard. I stumbled backward. My ears rang. The crucifix on the wall cracked again louder this time. The arms of Christ bent slightly inward, as if recoiling. A wind moved through the crypt, but there were no windows, no doors open, and in that moment, I realized something horrible. The more I read the gospel, the less I belong to the church I once served. That night, Lucian came to my room. He didn't knock, just stood in the doorway, as pale as stone. I heard you speaking, he said, but it wasn't Latin. It wasn't human. What did I say? He shook his head. It wasn't your voice. I checked my hands, my lips, my tongue. They were all trembling. I tried to pray again before sleep, forced my body into the posture I'd held for decades. I whispered, "Dear Lord," but the name Lord caught in my throat like a bone. And instead, I said something else, something ancient, something wrong, a name that didn't belong in any holy place. And outside my window, something knocked back. Episode 6, what the gospel said about Judas after his death. There are names you don't speak in holy places, not because they are forbidden, but because they are still listening. Judas Iscariot. I never preached his story with hatred, nor mercy. He was the wound in the shape of a man reason the cross had meaning. That's what they taught us. That's what I repeated, until the gospel showed me otherwise. I bled again. It wasn't ritual anymore. It was addiction. Every cut opened a verse, and every verse opened a truth I didn't ask for. But this one had a name written before the words appeared. It appeared in reverse, like a ghost carving its name backward on a fog mirror. Judas. The ink came like oil this time, thick, heavy. The letters bled slowly, as if reluctant to be remembered. He was chosen not to betray. He was chosen to witness. My breath caught. My blood slowed. A sudden, ice cold dread crawled up my spine and fear of the content. But fear that I believed it. The next line emerged like it had waited centuries for a tongue. He kissed not the Christ, but the veil, and the veil tore not from his lips, but from his silence. The page trembled in my hands. He was speaking as if Judas had written it after death, not in a journal, not in regret, but in vindication. The monks held a gathering that night. Lucian said something had changed in the air, claimed the statues in the courtyard had turned their backs on the chapel. One of the younger brothers, eyes white from fever, kept repeating the same phrase over and over. He hung himself to stop the gospel. He hung himself to stop the gospel. I demanded to know what he meant, and he finally whispered. He was the first to read it. That night, I opened the gospel once more. I didn't bleed this time, but the book did. From its spine, a thin trail of crimson leaked onto the altar stone, and from that blood, new text began to appear, no cut required. Judas spoke the first verse, and in his silence, God wept. I left the crypt in a daze. As I reached the top of the stairs, the candlelight flickered violently. I turned to look back down into the darkness, and saw a figure standing at the bottom, rope around its neck, eyes wide, not accusing, not pleading, just watching. It didn't speak, but I heard the message in my bones. You are not reading this gospel. You are continuing it. Episode 7. The verse that made angels cry blood. The angels wept blood on a Tuesday, not in a vision, not in metaphor, but in the stone courtyard beneath the chapel, where the statue stood frowning in praise for nearly 300 years. I watched it happen. First, the silence, the kind that arrives before a scream. Then, the crack of stone shifting, and thin tears, red and warm, streaming from carved eyes that had never seen. No one touched them. No storm had passed. No vandal had dared. Only one thing had changed. I have read the next verse. I didn't even mean to. It appeared before I bled. The gospel opened itself sometime before dawn. I found it waiting for me, already open, already whispering. I approached with caution, like one approaches a grave that has begun to breathe. The page was trembling and bleeding. From the parchment itself, lines of blood etched across the surface in real time, forming words that felt like blasphemy and truth in equal measure. When angels looked upon this verse, they forgot the sound of his voice, and they wept, for it reminded them what they once were. Before obedience stole wonder, my knees buckled. I fell to the ground, because in that moment he didn't feel like a priest. I felt like something lower than dust. The statues began crying 2 hours later. Lucian called me first. His voice shook. Come to the courtyard, he said, but come without scripture. By the time I arrived, 5 monks were already kneeling, not in reverence, in fear. The angel statuettes once carved with open palms and upward eyes were bleeding from their sockets. Thick trails of red stained their marble cheeks. No cracks, no damage, only tears. Brother Mateuian, newly ordained, approached me, trembling. Father Elias, he whispered, they're not just weeping, they're mourning. That night, none of the candles would light in the chapel. The altar cloth turned damp with the water, and one of the angel statues moved. I know what you're thinking, but I swear on the soul of every saint buried beneath this monastery it moved. Only an inch, only once, but his face was turned toward the window, toward the sky, not in hope, in accusation. I went to the gospel again, not to read, to question, but it had already answered. A new verse greeted me, freshly written. Do not ask where heaven is, ask why its gate is closed from the inside. And at the bottom of the pageant, drawn in blood not mine, a single, perfect feather, charred at the edges, still warm. Episode 8, the blood that didn't belong to any of us. The trail appeared at dawn, not footsteps, not mud, just blood, a perfect line of crimson, stretching from the front doors of the chapel to the crypt stairs. No footprints, no smears, no sores. It hadn't rained, no one had entered, and yet there it was, fresh, warm, impossible. The gospel had summoned someone, or something. I called for the brothers. We stood around it like fools, each too afraid to speak first. Lucian crossed himself 3 times before whispering, this isn't ours. He was right. We checked everyone, every hand, Every foot, every robe. No cuts, no wounds, not a drop missing. It wasn't Monk's blood. I sent a sample to the nearest hospital under the pretense of routine testing. The reply came by phone. The technician's voice was uncertain, cautious. This sample, it doesn't match any known human blood type. What do you mean? I asked. He hesitated. It doesn't match anything. That night, the trail began to move. I swear by every word I've ever spoken in prayer it grew. By inches, every hour, it crept down the stone stairs of the crypt like a living vein, always forward, never back. By midnight, it reached the altar where the gospel Saturday, and then it stopped. Not dried, not faded, just waiting. The next morning, the gospel bled before I even touched it. The edges of the page soaked with dark red, curling like burned parchment. No cut was needed. It had already fed. New text began to rise, but unlike before, the words were not written in the clean, divine calligraphy I had seen in previous verses. They were rough, violent, scratched into the page like fingernails against bone. Not all blood is from earth. Some bleed to remember where they fell from. I felt a chill settle into my spine. This wasn't confession. This was testimony. At Vespers, Brother Mateo collapsed. He had been silent for hours, eyes distant, hands shaking. When we rushed to him, we found his fingers smeared with blood. He had written something across the chapel floor, in a spiral, like a snake circling a flame. 6 words. It's not coming for us. It's coming through us. Later, I returned to the gospel. One final sentence had appeared beneath the blood. This blood is the key. You have already opened the door. I stared at the trail that now pulsed faintly in the candlelight, and I knew this wasn't a message. It was a summoning, and I had been the voice it needed to speak. Episode 9. The gospel was never written by man. The pages moved on their own today, not turned by wind, not by hand. They shivered like they were reacting to a presence in the room I could not see. At first I thought it was just candlelight playing tricks, but the flame never flickered, and yet the parchment fluttered like it was afraid of something. I didn't bleed this time, didn't need to. The gospel had grown, hungry enough to feed on presence alone. The new page was black, not ink burned, as if fire has scorched the page in precise lines to form scripture. There was no heading, no verse number, just the first sentence. This gospel was not written by hands that ever sinned. Strange until I realized what it meant. It wasn't saying the author was holy. It was saying the author had never been human. Lucien found me kneeling beside the book. Hours later, I hadn't moved. I hadn't blinked. He said my lips were whispering things he couldn't understand, but I remember none of it. What I do remember is what came next. The next line on the page revealed itself slowly, bleeding through like wine soaking through linen. Before the word was spoken, something else was whispered, and what whispered, it still listens beneath the throne. I left the crypt and locked it behind me. For the first time since arriving here, I felt like I wasn't reading a holy text. I was being read by it, measured, weighed, prepared. The book wasn't revealing truth. It was peeling away the human parts of me like bark stripped from a tree, not to punish, to make room for something else. That evening, the monastery's bell rang once, just once. No wind, no pull, no monk near the tower, and in the courtyard, the angel statues had moved again, subtly, but enough. Their heads were no longer lifted in praise. They were bowed, as if in mourning or surrender. I returned to the gospel after midnight. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I still had the choice to walk away. But when I entered the crypt, the book was already open, the pages turning slowly by themselves and after another, like a thing preparing to wake. And then the final line of the night appeared written in no language I recognized, but I understood it anyway. You are not reading me, you are becoming me. I touched the page, just slightly, and I felt it deep inside as something ancient, coiled and sacred, smiling without form. That night, I did not sleep, I did not dream, I only listened, and somewhere below this earth, something turned its face toward me. Episode 10. The child who spoke his last chapter in tongues. They found him in the woods behind the monastery, barefoot, no coat, eyes closed but not blind. He was no older than 10, no name, no documents, not even a missing child report in the region. He didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't even blink, but when we brought him inside, he knelt in front of the gospel like he already knew where it waited. Brother Mateo was the first to suggest it. He's been summoned, he whispered, voice shaking. The book didn't need more blood, it needed a mouth. We kept the child under supervision, offered him food and warmth. He refused everything. He just sat there, hands folded, eyes closed, as if in a trance that never ended. Until the third night, I was in the chapel when I heard it, a sound like water dripping but faster, with syllables tapping against stone. When I stepped into the crypt, I saw him. The boy stood barefoot before the altar. The gospel was open. He wasn't reading it, he was speaking it, but the words, they weren't in Latin, or Hebrew, or Greek. They were in something older, a language I felt in my ribs, in my spine, like a sound sunk inside a wound. Brother Lucien rushed in behind me. He stopped cold, his face went pale, and then, slowly, he knelt, not in prayer, in terror. The last chapter, he said under his breath. He's saying the final chapter. I asked how he could possibly know that, and he looked at me with tears in his eyes. Because I dreamed it once. He whispered, 30 years ago, I thought it was madness. The boy's voice grew louder. The candles dimmed. The shadows stretched up the walls like hands trying to escape. And, 10. He stopped, mid-sentence, silent. Not peace, not rest, pressure, like the room was holding its breath. The child opened his eyes for the first time since we'd found him. They weren't brown, weren't blue. They were the color of old, paper-edged, cracked, alive. He looked at me and spoke in perfect English. If you read the last line, heaven forgets where the door is. He collapsed. No wounds, no injury, just empty. His mouth still moved, but the words were silent now, like he'd passed the flame to someone else. And the gospel, it had closed itself. We buried the boy behind the monastery. No name, no cross, only a single sentence etched into the stone above him. He spoke what angels feared to remember. That night, I dreamed of him, but in the dream, he was older, wearing my robes, holding the gospel, and whispering a line I hadn't read yet, but knew I eventually would. This voice is not mine anymore. Episode 11. The woman who bled without wounds. She arrived at the monastery gate just before sunset, barefoot, silent, dressed in black. No one had seen her approach. No horse, no car, no footprints in the dirt path behind her, just the soft trail of blood beneath her toes. And yet here was no injury. Her skin was unbroken, but the blood kept dripping. Lucien opened the gate. She didn't speak, didn't blink, only looked past him, toward the crypt. I met her in the chapel, tried to offer her warmth. Water, words anything? She shook her head once and whispered. The gospel called me. Her voice was strange, not hollow, not cold, but borrowed like it belonged to a choir that had been silent centuries ago. I asked her name. She paused, hugged, then answered. I had one, before I dreamed the ink. I asked what she meant. She looked at me, with eyes full of sorrow, not hers, as if she carried the grief of something celestial. I saw the verses, she said, before they were written, and when I woke up, I was already bleeding. We brought her into the crypt. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch when the doors opened, didn't even gasp when she saw the gospel waiting already open, already breathing. As she stepped toward it, the blood from her feet grew darker, slower, and then stopped completely. The book acknowledged her. The pages turned on their own, not frantically, not chaotically, but reverently, like it was preparing for someone it hadn't seen in lifetimes. Then she spoke, not from memory, not in recitation, but in perfect synchrony with the words bleeding onto the parchment. She who bleeds without wounds remembers the first promise. Before sin, before fall, before the first light, she kept the name that even God cannot speak. Her voice shifted, it deepened, echoed, as if the air behind her remembered a different shape. Brother Mateo fainted. Lucien dropped his rosary, and me, I stood frowning, because I recognized the final line as she spoke it, not from the gospel, but from a dream I had as a child, a dream I never told anyone. She's the blood that reminds heaven it once had flesh. She touched the book, and for the first time since it was found, The gospel closed itself, not with rejection, not with anger, but with completion, like it had been waiting for her signature. She turned to leave. "Wait," I whispered. "Who are you?" She looked at me, and for a moment, her eyes were entirely blank. Then she smiled a sad, ancient smile. "I am the memory that bleeds in silence. You are the voice that keeps it alive." She walked out, and as her bare feet touched the ground again, no blood followed. She had finished her part, and the gospel had remembered hers. Episode 12. The final verse cannot be read by the living. There is a silence that comes before death. It doesn't hum. It doesn't whisper. It listens. And the crypt had been listening all night. No one dared enter after she left. The gospel hadn't opened again. The air around it was thick, unwelcoming, like something sacred had curled itself inward and begun to rot. But I knew what it wanted. It wanted an ending. I prepared my body like a man preparing for burial. I confessed, bathed, wrote a letter I never signed, and then I descended into the dark with nothing but my blood and breath. The book waited, closed, for the first time in weeks. Still, I laid my hand on the cover, warm, alive. I didn't cut myself. This time, the blood came on its own. A single drop slid from my left nostril, unprovoked, and fell onto the leather skin. The book pulsed, then opened. Only one page remained. The final one, its edges curled like they had tried to burn themselves away. There were no words, only space. And then, without warning, I felt it. Not pain, but absence. My heartbeat slowed, my breath shallowed, and in that narrowing silence, the verse revealed itself. The final verse cannot be read by the living. To know the last line is to leave your name behind. Only those who are halfway between breath and burial may understand it. I fell to my knees. Something was leaving, me slowly, gently like steam rising from water. My thoughts felt distant, memories blurred. The name of my mother, the smell of incense in my childhood church, gone. But one thing remained, the verse. New lines bled through the parchment, not just words instructions. Close your eyes, unclench your soul, let go of the idea of heaven. I obeyed, not out of faith, but because I could no longer resist. And then, I saw it, not with eyes, with something older than vision, a flash of something not meant for the living, a sky underneath the earth, a throne made of bone and salt, in a single, enormous hand, writing with light that screamed. I opened my eyes. I was back in the crypt, breathing, shaking, alive. The gospel had closed again, sealed shut. My hands were clean, my body uncut, but inside me, something had shifted. The silence I carried was not human anymore. Lucian later asked me what the last verse said. I tried to speak, but my tongue wouldn't move. Instead, I wrote a single sentence. I didn't read it, it read me. The book has remained closed ever since. No blood awakens it, no prayer stirs it. It is done, or waiting, but I know one truth now, and it will never leave me. The final verse isn't meant to be read aloud. It is meant to be remembered in death. Episode 13. The Saint Who Burned in Reverse. It began with the smell of smoke, but no fire. The chapel was cold, the candles unlit, and yet the scent of something burned clung to the walls. Not incense, flesh. That morning, Brother Lucian was missing. We searched the courtyard, the bell tower, the forest trail. Nothing, until we heard the weeping. It was coming from beneath the chapel, from the crypt, from where the gospel slept. But the book wasn't the one weeping. He was. Lucian stood barefoot before the altar, robe soaked in ash. His hands trembled at his sides. His skin glowed with light, but with heat like coal just before it bursts. I stepped forward. "Lucian, what have you done?" He turned slowly, eyes wide. "Iris is the color of dried blood." I touched the cover. He said, "I didn't mean to open it. It opened me." His chest steamed in the cold air, and then he whispered the words I still can't forget. It showed me the death of saints, but in reverse. Before I could stop him, he stepped onto the altar and collapsed, and that's when it started. His body began to smoke, but not burn outward. The heat came from within. Bones turned dark, organs shimmered beneath his skin. But instead of turning to ash, he began to hew and burn. Hair grew back, wrinkles disappeared, scars vanished. He was undoing, Brother Matteo fainted. The others knelt in horror. But I watched, because something in me recognized the miracle for what it was. Punishment disguised as rebirth. The gospel was not resurrecting him. It was rewinding him until he was no longer Brother Lucian, until he was nothing but a breath in a womb, a spark of a thought, a whisper before language. Anton was gone, not dead, never born. Where his body once lay, there was only a page, not parchment, skin, still warm, still wet. I picked it up, hands shaking, the gospel's final gift, or final curse, one line carved across it. He burned backward because it tried to walk forward. And beneath that, not every saint is remembered. Some are erased. We buried nothing that night. No coffin, no globes, no name, just a hole in the earth. In a prayer none of us dared to speak. Because who do you pray to when the book you serve on writes the holy? The next morning, the angel statues were facing the opposite direction. Away from that chapel, away from heaven, and the gospel, still closed, still quiet. But now, it smelled like smoke, not destruction. Warning, episode 14, when God covered his own eyes. There are verses not meant to be spoken aloud, not because they summon demons, but because they summon memory, the kind God buried in himself and refused to look at again. And last night, the gospel showed me one of them. The page wasn't new. It was older than the rest. The parchment looked sick, like skin stretched tightly over regret. I hadn't bled that day. I hadn't even touched the book, but it opened on its own, as if dreaming through me. The words emerged slowly, fading into view like bruises surfacing beneath pale flesh. There was a moment, before the garden, before the fall, when he saw what would come and could not bear it. The ink wept down the page like sweat, like it was ashamed of itself. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The words pulled at me. The next line bled through, and so, for 3 divine seconds, he covered his eyes, and in that blindness something else looked back. That night, the stars over the monastery vanished. Not behind clouds, not with weather, just gone. The sky was velvet black, a void so complete, it felt like the world had been turned away from its maker. Brother Matteo came running through the halls, eyes wild. Something is in the chapel, he whispered. Not a man, not an angel, but something that remembers both. We went together. The candles lit themselves as we entered on by own, not with flame, but with shivering light that cast no shadows. And there, kneeling in the center of the chapel, was a figure draped in white. No face, no feet, just hands covering where the eyes should have been. The moment I stepped forward, I felt every childhood sin pour back into my lungs. It didn't speak, it didn't move, but the gospel locked in the crypt below turned a page on its own. In my mind, I heard it, not a voice, a moment, a pause in eternity. The page whispered, even he could not bear the full cost of free will, so he covered his eyes. And in that blink, the first sorrow was born. The figure in white trembled, and then slowly removed its hands. There were no eyes beneath, only 2 black holes where light fell in but never came out. And I knew this wasn't God. This was the moment God looked away, made flesh, made witness. Brother Matteo dropped to the floor, praying in reverse, his mouth forming words that sounded holy, but ended in weeping. The candles extinguished all at once, and when I lit my lantern, that chapel was empty, except for one thing, a new verse etched into the altar stone, not written by hand, carved by will. To see everything is divine. To see too much is blasphemy. I haven't prayed since, not because I've lost faith, but because I'm afraid he might be listening again, and I don't want him to see what I've seen. Not yet. Episode 15. This gospel was never meant to be found. There is a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace. It doesn't soothe, it warns. For 3 nights now, the gospel hasn't moved. No pages turned, no blood appeared, no voices, only stillness. And in that stillness he understood. It wasn't resting, it was waiting for me to accept what I already knew. This book was never meant to be found. I went to the Vatican once. As a young seminarian, they told us that every gospel had a purpose, to guide, to teach, to save. But this one doesn't guide, it drags. It doesn't teach, it unwrites. And it doesn't save, It remembers what haven't buried. The final night began with a knock. Not at the monastery gate, not on a door, on the gospel itself. 3 soft knocks, like knuckles on wood, from inside the page. When I opened it, no new verse appeared. Just a question scratched faintly into the corner of the last page. Why did you keep reading? I had no answer, but my heart did. Because I needed to know. Because I thought knowledge would give me power. Because I thought faith alone would shield me. But the truth is simpler. I read it because it wanted to be read. And that was the trap. I returned the gospel to the crypt altar, lit the final candle, and placed my hand upon the cover one last time. No blood this time, only stillness. And 10. The pages turned by themselves. All of them, faster than the wind, faster than my breath, until they stopped at the first page. Not the ones I have read, the ones written before I ever bled. There was a hidden preface, a warning sealed beneath centuries of silence. The ink was gray, like ash. This gospel was not written for humanity. It was buried beneath the garden and sealed in the blood of the first mistake. I read on, heart racing. Whoever opens this book must understand. You are not reading history. You are releasing memory. And when it is done, the author will return. Behind me, I heard something brief, not air, not spirit, something older than either. I didn't turn. I didn't pray. I simply closed the book. And for the first time since the day it was found, the gospel stayed closed. No blood seeped. No verse followed. It was finished. I buried it beneath the chapel floor, 4 feet deep, wrapped in robes, sealed in salt, locked beneath iron nails and 1,000 whispered prayers. I barely remembered how to speak. And still, as I pressed the final stone into place, I felt it like breath on the back of my neck. It had already written itself into me. If you are reading this, burn the page, not because it holds evil, but because it holds memory, and memory is the last thing that should bleed.